welcome to another episode of Women Investing in Women. My co-host Robin and I take tremendous amount of pleasure and honor to feature different women each week so that we amplify their voice, we amplify their message, and we connect their purpose with other women so that in our shared purpose and in our shared drive to lift each other up and build a better world, through our unity and through our connectedness, we truly can accelerate the impact we're making. I was raised in an environment to believe that how a society treats its women is truly the soul of that community. And today we're going to be talking to a professional woman who is truly making an impact in that arena to create awareness and wake up the spirit and the soul of people who are in a community. And you're going to love this introduction Robin is going to make. Robin, take it away.
Absolutely. I am beyond thrilled to have Emma Cordover with us. She is a wonderful journalist who works with Politico. And I was reading an article that she wrote about the SAVE Act, S-A-V-E Act, that is taking place here in the United States, which has a profoundly negative impact on women, especially married women. And so I reached out to her. And I said, hey, we would love to have you on our show. Tell us about this act that has a profound impact on women, how you started researching it, and what motivates you and moves you. And so she reached back out to me, and here she is. So Emma, please take it away. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you started researching and writing this great article alerting us about the SAVE Act.
Amazing. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I'm so excited. This is very, very, very fun for me. Yeah, a little bit about myself. I've been at Politico for 2 years, and I co-author a newsletter called Women Rule with my co-author, Catherine Long. And we basically cover the issues that are most impacting women every week. The newsletter is released weekly on Fridays. And that's what led me to the SAVE Act. So a little bit of background on the bill. The SAVE Act, or the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act is what it stands for, is a bill that would require all voters, all American voters, to provide proof of U.S. citizenship when they're registering to vote or updating their voter registration. So that would include a passport or a birth certificate to present to register to vote. And it was introduced in the House of Congress in January, and it passed on April 10th with unanimous Republican support, along with 4 Democratic votes, so very much on party lines. And right just as soon as it passed, the discourse about the bill immediately started to revolve around its potential impact on married women, like you said. The opponents of the bill, which were voting rights activists and all the Democrats that voted against it, were worried about its potential to disenfranchise millions of American women from accessing the polls. So actually 69 million American women have changed their last name. So that's around 25% of the population. And voting rights activists were worried that if women came to present their proof of U.S. citizenship, i.e. their birth certificate, and the name on their birth certificate didn't match their driver's license or some other form of documentation, that they would potentially not be able to register to vote. So that was the process that was most worrying for the opponents of the bill. And the conversation just immediately began to surround that. So much so that on Friday, so it passed on a Thursday, and then on Friday, the White House press secretary actually addressed this issue specifically at the podium in a press conference. And she basically quelled all of the concern, or attempted to, and said that it was a, quote, complete fallacy that the bill could affect married women negatively at all. And so that was Friday. And then on the following Sunday, I was pitching to my editor what we would write about that week for our newsletter. And I think we actually both at the same time kind of messaged each other like, SAVE Act, SAVE Act. Okay, this is what we need to talk about, because it seemed very obviously salient. And then I got to work sourcing for the story, and we knew we had a Friday deadline. So I just pretty much immediately reached out to all of the Republican co-sponsors of the bill, all the co-sponsors, and then all of the Democrats that had been particularly outspoken about it or had a certain position of power within Congress that was relevant to the bill, so in a voting rights space. And with sourcing like this on a deadline, you kind of just first come, first serve, you get what you get. And I was very lucky to be able to speak with 2 Democrats and 1 Republican, Reps Judy Chu, Jennifer McClellan, and Lisa McLean. Lisa McLean was one of the co-sponsors, and she was the Republican. And I think the biggest thing that I noticed and that I wanted to bring into this conversation from my reporting on this subject was, I think I've spoken to a lot of Congress people about their legislation, and I've talked a lot to politicians about various subjects, and I'm not unfamiliar with partisanship and divide and contention. But I think it was remarkably palpable for this piece of legislation. I think the divide was really intense, and each side was kind of lobbing very hefty jabs at the other side. The Democrats were saying that, this is just another example of Republican voter suppression, that Republicans have been trying to suppress voters for years, and that it was just another attempt to hold on to power and to suppress as many voters as they can, including women, and that it was therefore very disrespectful to women and very hurtful to women, where the Republicans were saying kind of the exact opposite and saying that it was really disrespectful of the Democrats to think that married women, quote, can't figure this out, and that it was actually coming from a place of disrespect for women that the Democrats were opposing it because, women, if you need an ID to buy a 6-pack of beer, why shouldn't you need one to vote? And, if women can figure that out, why can't they figure this out? So it was really interesting how respect for women and the way women are treated in society was kind of being used as a tool, as a kind of political tool on both sides. So yeah, I mean, it was a fascinating piece to report out, just simply because of the passion and kind of vitriol that was coming from both sides, and also because of how interesting the role of women was playing in this piece of legislation, and that ostensibly doesn't have to do directly with women. It's a voting rights bill, but women became the kind of core of both arguments on both sides.
So it's interesting we're talking about the SAVE Act. For me specifically, because I come from a society, I'm born and raised in Sri Lanka. As Sri Lankan Hindus, we do not take a father's name or a husband's name because they're each a soul. And the name is the identity of the soul. It's not who gave life to the body, because the life is separate and apart from the body. So I don't come from a culture where women change names. All of this is an issue. But I live in the United States. I'm an American citizen, so I see lots of different perspectives. But it always fascinates me as to why women are always the football in the game. And I also don't understand, with 51% of the population being women, why don't women collectively stand up and change the rules of the game instead of perpetuating the game? So my question to you is, as a reporter, as a person who's trying to educate and empower the audience and the readers, where you see the opportunity.
I think that's such an interesting point. I also come from a different background than the US. My mom is from Spain, where they hyphenate the name, and it's still, the lineage still comes from the father's side, but everyone has 2 last names, and one of them is your mother's last name. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting facet of American society, and I think the answer to this, I mean, I don't know if I have the exact correct answer, but I think my understanding is it's rooted in an attachment to tradition. And I think there's a lot of, especially what we're seeing right now in American politics, I think there's an instinct and an urge to foster community and foster belonging, in whether that be patriotic belonging or, in your communities. I keep saying that word, but I think there's this, and we're seeing it in politics, this kind of, it feels almost like a regression, like we're going kind of backwards, and we're returning to these so-called traditional values, traditional family values. I think that word is used a lot in the Republican rhetoric. The traditional family, we want to protect that. Even a lot of the immigration rhetoric comes down to protecting, Americans and holding on to a real American identity and not letting that go. So I think all of that cultural narrative can get in the way, as I see it, with empowerment sometimes. This almost emotional facet of humans is directly directing or having an influence on policy. And I think, yeah, so just to address the last name change thing, I mean, I would love to know the history of where that came from, like whose idea it first was. I'm sure it comes from like a long time ago when women didn't have any rights. But I think in the same way that people get married in a white dress and are walked down the aisle by their father, I think there's that attachment to tradition where I think it's easy to say, you know, this is just a tradition, this is just a nice thing that we do in our society. It doesn't actually have an impact in or on anything that we do day to day. But I think this bill is a great example of how that return to tradition or that holding on to tradition can actually have a tangible impact, not just your day to day, but I mean, your, you know, the entire fabric of our democracy. So yeah, I mean, I wish I don't plan to change my last name. I'm not married, but I don't plan to do it. And my mom didn't either, actually. But I think from my understanding, it just is rooted in that sense of wanting to belong and wanting to be a part of a long lineage of something, you know, holding on to that. I think everyone has that instinct as a human being. But yeah, I mean, I think this bill is almost a red flag or like an alert to be like, hey, some of these traditions might be potentially detrimental. But also ideally, I would say the tradition doesn't have to be detrimental if we didn't, you know, if this bill wasn't an issue. Like there's layers of problems here. And I think this bill is rooted in this kind of, from my understanding, falsehood that swaths of illegal voters and illegal immigrants are voting in American elections, which has been studied and disproven. But, you know, I think we could address this issue from myriad standpoints, but yeah, I think it comes back to that return to tradition and wanting to belong. I don't know if that comprehensively answers your question. It's
Yeah,
what
that's a really great answer, really insightful answer. In your research as a journalist, and my original major when I went off to college back in 1975 was broadcast journalism. So I changed it later. I changed my major later, but I have a very soft spot for journalists and a huge respect for the profession of journalism. I believe it is crucial to our democracy. So when you were doing your research on this act or on other elements, other topics that you're researching, there will always be people presenting different points of view. And so how do you as a journalist go about ferreting out what is true? I mean, what is factual that you can actually see and hold and measure versus something that is not factual, that they are claiming is factual, but then you can see, you know, was it ringing on Inauguration Day or not ringing on Inauguration Day? So at any rate, how do you go about as a journalist ferreting out what is true and how do you go about writing and reporting about that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I appreciate your vote of confidence for the journalism world. I agree with you. I think it's wildly important, you know, more than ever now. And it's a great question. I think it's something that every journalist might have to grapple with at some point. But my answer would be that there's very intentional guidelines on how to write as a journalist. I think you never, you know, whenever you're quoting somebody or you're explaining somebody's point of view, you always specify that that is what they say, and that is what they are alleging, or that is what they have researched. You would never claim that opinion as your own and state it as a fact. So I think those language barriers are really important. Like you'll notice in the article that I wrote, I always, you know, it's always voting rights activists say that this could potentially disenfranchise millions of voters. So, you know, that language is really important. And I think readers hopefully can pick up on and distinguish that this is, you know, we're relaying information. We're not asserting that it's necessarily true. And I think the other thing is it's always important to share both sides of whatever issue that you're covering. I mean, with this bill, it was obvious that I needed to quote a Republican and a Democrat, you know, a proponent and an opponent. But I think any other piece of writing or reporting, you always, if you quote one side, you always have to quote the other. And I think that also helps with not only maintaining that what you're saying isn't necessarily factual as a reporter, but also making sure that the reader is informed comprehensively. And then the last thing I think is I rely a lot on my reporting on research and on peer-reviewed studies and data. And I think that's always something really important to include. I think data journalism is growing a lot now, actually, which I think is amazing. And I think, yeah, in this article, I specifically cited two or three studies on whether illegal immigrants were voting or not, because it was something that the Republican Congresswoman had alleged was happening, all across the country. And so I cited these three studies from nonpartisan, or actually one of them was from a right-leaning policy institute. So I think that's another thing that you can rely on to cite as, I didn't do the research, it's not coming from me, but I know that X many people have reviewed it. It comes from this reputable source, and it's something that we can at least bring into the conversation to reference. But yeah, I think the biggest thing is not ever asserting that something is fact. It's you kind of get away from having to determine what is fact and what is not by not even engaging with that process at all and just presenting what the opinions are and then using, hard factual data to back up anything that you want to assert. So yeah, there's language to protect against that. But and then the last thing I'll say is that it is hard. I think everyone has opinions, including journalists. I have opinions on everything. I think, and again, every journalist will also say this, that it's a continuous challenge and goal to keep all of your emotion and opinion and instinct out of the copy, just to make sure that the copy isn't reflecting any of that. So, and it's something that my editor, has helped me with, and something I've helped others with. So it's a constant kind of collaborative struggle. But I think it's important to help the public understand that what journalists are doing is not arguing a case, but rather presenting all sides of a story. It's telling a story in the most comprehensive way possible.
I appreciate that, Emma. Coming from a perspective of a finance executive in the major corporate world, one of the tenets of our profession is do not bring your bias into the recommendations for decision making, because your biases have nothing to do with what the business has to do. And then as an educator, I'm always guiding my students on how to do research without the bias. So totally hear where you're coming from. I want to build on this conversation and go to a slightly different but related place. There are intended and unintended consequences of things like this. So the public policies we have put in place to what you referred to as tradition, I personally, as an outsider, refer to it as a way of life where a society has figured out how ownership is structured. Technically, surname, whoever who sired you, sir means your master, right? So children have a father's name because he's the sir, he owns the children. And when children come of age, the sons become the new owners, and the father giving the daughter away is the father giving over his property to his future son-in-law. So it's technically a property transaction from a legal perspective. From a financial perspective, that's why women couldn't have bank accounts till the 70s. And it was not made possible to have bank accounts practically till the mid 80s. It took 10 years for financial institutions to even get there in the United States. Right? So when we are talking about tradition that is rooted in ownership and how assets are managed and people are assets, some people are assets of other people and some people own stuff, right? When we start living in a culture like that, what are the unintended consequences of something like this? I ask this because women's inability to hold on to a job and grow if they got married and when they have children, a lot of women are self-selecting out of marriage. A lot of women are self-selecting out of having children. We're in the middle of a youth crisis. Universities are expected to close down because we don't have enough students, right? Mm-hmm. And having your name changed may be a problem for voting. But if you don't have your name changed, you may be stopped at immigration saying you're kidnapping somebody else's child because your child's last name is not your last name. So as a woman, there are all these complications in this society because of the ownership rights of life. And I'm taking a pure financial perspective because when you follow the money, the ownership follows.
Yeah. So, what are the unintended consequences of all of this? I think I don't probably know them all. I think there are some that are yet to be discovered. And I think it's a really interesting point that you're bringing up. And I haven't really thought about it in that way, in the ownership framework, because and it very much is that historically. The challenges that women are facing today seem to be exponentially increasing. I think as I write about issues that affect women every week, or every other week with my co-author, and we're talking about what we want to write about next, I think, especially under this administration, we are never short short of content to write about. There's always something happening, whether that's fertility related stuff. I think he called himself the fertilization president, IVF rules and regulations, obviously abortion access, even research grants to women's health studies that are being cut. So I think all of that, you could look at all of that through the lens of ownership as well. Women are increasingly less able to have ownership over their own bodies. I mean, abortion is a perfect example of that. And even the fertility stuff as well. It's like people are writing rules over, prescriptive guidelines over what a woman can do with her own body. And so I think those are some of the consequences of just the way society sees women. If we see women as a means to an end. I wrote a story 2 weeks ago, I think it was my edition 2 weeks ago, about a woman in Georgia who had passed away and was being kept on life support to essentially incubate her fetus because she was 9 weeks pregnant at the time that she died. So I think that's a kind of another not great example, but it's an apt example of the ownership idea, because it was like the state was almost asserting its ownership over her body as a vessel to incubate this life. That's why I said that they're innumerable, and I probably haven't thought of them all yet, because I think every month and week you see something else that's just shocking. And that story was particularly harrowing, I will say. And so I think all of these, a lot of the reproductive health legislation that's coming out, and just the changes to the way that we see reproductive health, and again, the way that we see the family and the way we see women's role in the family, are all examples of how this ownership dynamic can trickle down. I think the motherhood medal, that was, I don't know if you've heard of that. It's this medal that's going to be given, money reward that's going to be given to any woman that has more than 5 kids or 6 kids, something like that. I'll fact check that. But it's just an interesting shift in the way that women are being seen in today's society as serving a purpose, and then also limiting women's ability to decide what happens to their bodies. In states where abortion is not legal, you don't have ownership. Once you become pregnant, it seems, especially in the case in Georgia, it seems that you no longer have ownership over your body. And that was what some of the people that I spoke to a lot about that case said, was that suddenly, you're pregnant, you pass away, your body doesn't belong to your family anymore. It somehow belongs to the state. And so the state has ownership over you. Obviously, that's like a very dramatic reading of it and a very intense reading of it, but it's a valid reading of it. So the consequences are multifold, and we probably haven't seen them all yet. And that's why I think it's just so important to write about them and to show how these things are happening, and to talk about it here, and to talk about how something as seemingly benign as changing your name can have, this really horrible consequence years down the line, and something as seemingly removed as changing IVF rules or, allowing abortion past the 6-week mark can have this very real, tangible kind of horror story effect on a woman and a family.
Before we wrap it up really quickly, can you quickly tell us how people can get a hold of you, and a very tiny status on the SAVE Act, and then if you have a final golden nugget, and then Cass will wrap it up.
Sure. Yeah. So you can email me. It's ecordover@politico.com. Maybe we can put it in the comments or something. My last name can be hard to spell, but please do reach out. We also my co-author and I always put our emails at the top of our newsletter in the chatter, so you can always find it there as well. Status on the SAVE Act is it's currently just awaiting a vote in the Senate. They haven't set a date for that vote yet, last time I checked. So when they do, I will definitely write about it and update you all. And if there was a last golden nugget, I think something I just wanted to leave people with is something I've been hearing a lot, and I'm sure everyone is too, is how overwhelming and depressing, and I just don't even want to watch the news anymore, and I just don't want to see this. It's too sad, or it's too confusing, or there's just like a media rainstorm at all times. And I think what I would just encourage is, although apathy may seem like the best option, don't let that get the better of you. And if you can find any way to take pleasure in educating yourself and learning about the things that are going on, if you can find joy in getting involved in your community and finding out about what's going on, wherever you may fall on the political spectrum, I think if you can find a way to get nuggets of information that are important and stay on top of what's going on day to day, the country will be a better place and the world will be a better place, just because you will be able to make informed decisions and to, read fact and legitimate news outlets, and to just, I think it's really easy to give up and, to just want to not look at it. But I would just really encourage you to not be apathetic, and if anything, just to find make it fun for yourself, get interested in something, not everything, you can't be an expert on everything, but get interested in something and figure out how to get involved with it. And I think your life will be better, and the world will be as well. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. We appreciate you, appreciate the work you do. A democracy cannot sustain itself without real reporters who are committed to the cause. So thank you for everything you do. Thank you to your team, everybody who makes it happen. And would love to continue this conversation, and welcome to the Women Investing in Women community. And to our audience out there, remember, in a democracy, what makes it work is you knowing your self-interest. So examine yourself, take an introspective journey and figure out what is in your best interest. Learn as much about it, because none of us are victims, knowingly or unknowingly. We create the environment we end up in. Once you know what's in your self-interest, then be a part of shaping the world that behooves you. Build the world you deserve. Build the world your family, your loved ones deserve. Because if we focus together and put our self-interest first, there's always a way to solve problems, because life doesn't happen in the either or extremes. Life happens in the middle. And if we can truly meet each other and see perspective, take perspective, and figure out ways to compromise, we as women know how to do this. That's where the magic happens. That's where our freedom lies. And that's truly where we are going to earn our power to build a better world.